everyone. I'm Mike Doran. I run the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute, and it is my honor and pleasure today to welcome Professor Bernie Haykel from Princeton. Hello, Bernie.
Hi, it's delightful to be here, and I'm honored to be discussing today's topic with you.
And of course, we're not just welcoming you as a guest here at this event, but we are also welcoming you as a senior fellow in the Middle East Center here at Hudson. You are the newest recruit to our project. Welcome there.
The honor is doubled for that, and I'm thrilled to be affiliated with Hudson. I look forward to doing a lot of things with you together jointly.
And you'll forgive me for a moment here. I'm just going to embarrass you a little bit by praising you. You are, of course, the leading expert on Saudi Arabia in the world, or certainly in the United States. You are also an expert on Yemen, on the Houthis. And the Gulf in general, and you are also a leading expert on Islam and Islamic movements. Have I hit everything? Are there any other things that you're the leading expert on that I haven't hit?
Um, well, you're kind to say all these things. You know, I was educated in the UK, as you know, and I just hope to live up to those expectations. I wouldn't describe myself in that way, but I aim to please.
Okay. All right. So, Bernie, what I wanted to do with you today, because I do regard you, I'm not flattering you or trying to be polite. I do regard you as the number one expert on Saudi Arabia. I don't think anyone understands the perspective from Riyadh better than you do. Anyone who isn't themselves a Saudi. And so, what I'd like to do is just do a tour of the horizon. The Middle East has changed so radically in the last few months. I'd like to sit ourselves down in Riyadh and look at the world and see what it looks like from Riyadh. And so to get us started, though, why don't you just give us in broad brushstrokes an understanding of the historic changes that Mohammed bin Salman has carried out in Saudi Arabia. It's almost a revolution that he's carried out, and I'd like to understand how you would describe that and what that means for the Saudi approach to the world.
Okay, so Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS, arrived on the scene in a very major way once his father became king in January 2015. So we're talking about a decade now of time. He was about 28, 29 at the time. And and I think with his father, viewed Saudi Arabia, the system, the political system, the economic system, social system as unsustainable, that the country was driven by an incredible amount of corruption, that the royal family was essentially parasitic on the system and just sucking the treasury dry, as well as the society, because they were getting involved in all kinds of business deals and taking cuts, and that the Islamists or the Islamic kind of institutions with alongside the Islamists were essentially preventing the country from being what MBS calls normal. In other words, that if Saudi Arabia was going to become economically prosperous, dynamic, and try to sever its deep dependence on oil, it had to become normal. The society had to create jobs, had to build a private sector in areas that are not linked to the fossil fuel industry. And so he made essentially two moves. The first move was to consolidate and centralize power by clipping the wings of other members of the royal family. The country was basically run kind of like the old days with the Politburo in the last decade of the Soviet Union. You had a bunch of guys basically running different institutions in the government, and a lot of it was the decision making was consensual and almost never happened because it had become a gerontocracy. Very old guys who had these deep clientelist relationships with different segments of the society, and the place was just unworkable. And so he got rid of that, all of those centers of power, and consolidated everything in his hands. The second thing he did was to uh, essentially also clip the wings of the religious establishment and said, you want to be religious, that's fine, that's your private affair, but you don't get involved in other people's lives. If people want to walk around veiled, unveiled, short hair, long hair, that's their business. So the it was a kind of social revolution, a liberalizing, not politically, but socially liberalizing move, with a lot of rights being given to women. And then the third thing, uh, really the first thing was really the social domestic political transformation. The second thing was actually the economic diversification plan, and this is where he's trying to build out whole new sectors of the Saudi economy, and try to make the country less dependent on oil. That's a very difficult thing to pull off. He wants to build a logistical hub, a transportation hub. He wants to be a tech, develop a huge tech sector, an alternative energy sector. He has lots of plans to kind of reshape and reform the entire economy of Saudi Arabia, and for which he needs the kind of social liberalization. He also wants to turn it into a major tourism destination, both religious tourism and high-end sort of tourism. Um, so those are broadly the kind of changes that he's brought about. He's now completely taken over in terms of power, and he's still working on the economic transformation, and that's still an unfolding process. Lastly, I would say, and this is the last point I would make, is that in clipping the wings of the religious establishment, he's basically saying that the new source of legitimacy and loyalty and identity for the Saudis is nationalism and not religion. And that's a very important shift. So you can think of him as doing kind of a lot like President Trump, Saudi first, just like America first. That's the kind of move he's making.
I want to call it a nationalist revolution. Is that a nationalist revolution from on high? Is that an
Yeah.
overstatement?
I mean, the Saudis are very conservative. They don't like the word revolution. They're more
Right.
Burkean in that sense. So they would call it a national transformation.
Okay, a nationalist transformation. This issue of the clipping the wings of the religious establishment is itself, I'm sorry to use the word again, but it's revolutionary. I mean that is my understanding, and I'm making a statement, but this is a question. That my understanding is that this is a complete. I always thought of the Saudi state going all the way back to the 18th century as a compact between the clerics and the Saudi family. And I always thought that they were basically equals. And lo and behold, this is not the case,
Yeah.
right? It's objectively now not the case. So it's forcing me, I think, to rethink actually what the Saudi state is.
Right. So I would say yes, there was an alliance or a compact between the religious establishment and the political authority going back to the 18th century. But if you look at the 20th century, the religious authority was, and religion in general, was really a tool in the hands of the political authority to dominate and control the society. So I don't think the religion was ever a co-equal. The religious establishment was ever a co-equal branch of government or group in society with the royals. The royals deployed religion to dominate their society. They find that no longer useful, so they're switching to something else. They've
Well,
always been the kind of the royals have always been the kind of main actors, really. And pragmatism and political control and domination is has always been the order of the day.
I guess I knew that. I would have if I was writing something out and I thought about it, I would have probably said it the way you said it. But I'm still shocked, very surprised. I could never have predicted the ease and the speed with which Mohammed bin Salman carried out this transformation with the religious
I, I
establishment.
I agree. I mean, I think no one looking at Saudi Arabia in 2014 or earlier, or even into the first year or two of King Salman's reign would have guessed that this was possible. We were always told that these other princes were powerful. They controlled different military kind of institutions, that the religious establishment could mobilize hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and so the royals were always constrained by them. But as it turns out, if you look at the religious establishment and if you look at the royals, they basically, because of the overwhelming wealth that came to the country beginning with the 1973 oil embargo, they basically became extremely lazy and spoiled and had kind of a super easy life with the government just giving everything. So, for 3, 4 decades, they were just sucking at the teat of the state. And so they were soft. And then you get this guy, MBS, who shows up, and he's the one wolf in the pack of sheep. And he
Uh,
just says, enough of this. And no one has basically the guts and the courage to stand up to him. And he saw that, and he went for the jugular and brought them all down.
Now, let's move to the economic dimension of this nationalist transformation. Um, because my sense is that Mohammed bin Salman is a man in a hurry.
Yeah,
And I would say he's a man in a hurry for two different reasons. One, uh, characterologically, this is just the character of the man. But but secondly, um, he sees Saudi Arabia is not Qatar or the UAE. This is a country of what we're probably over 35 million now. I haven't checked
guest
the
workers, they're about 36. Yeah.
36 million people. So he has a very large young population that has to be employed. And he wants it to have a piece, he wants Saudi Arabia to have a piece of the modern world, the modern global economy. And as you said in your opening remarks, it can't just be a piece of the petrochemical industry. There has to be much more to it if this very large, dynamic, and growing and with a population that's growing very quickly is going to have its piece of the global pie. And so there's a sense that he has a sense that he's racing against time to provide modern jobs for these young people. Do I have that right? Is there
Yeah.
another dimension of the?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, he is, I think, in a hurry, partly, as you say, his character is one where he likes, fast, quick fixes to problems. But also, I think he is someone who is deeply aware that with the energy transition that's happening, with the fact that the UAE has got a 15-year head start over Saudi Arabia, with the fact that his population cannot be is too large to just be bought off. A new social contract has to be designed so that they get good paying jobs. They get eventually will be taxed. There's no income tax in Saudi Arabia. To be able to make up for the loss of revenue from oil. So those are the things that are guiding him, and I think they're rooted in a deep kind of uh, need to assure the survival of the regime, because if the regime doesn't transform, if the country doesn't transform, the regime doesn't survive.
Now, I went to Saudi Arabia about a year ago, I think it was, and what another thing that really struck me, which I wasn't expecting, was how popular all of this was. I and because I talked to a lot of different people, and you travel abroad enough, you can tell when people are just declaiming the talking points that they think they're supposed to say, and when they are transmitting genuine enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about, talking to restaurant owners, business owners. I went into a business, talked to young people who were in there, very impressive young people working, women and men sitting together in cubicles, doing very serious work. They were all they had a feeling of being a part of a new, very exciting project. You agree with that as well, that this is
I
really.
think I think the anecdotal evidence certainly supports what you said. I think there's a generational divide. I think people who are sort of 35 and under genuinely love what he's doing and are believe in the kind of promise of transformation. there's a sting to that, which I'll come back to in a second. Older people, though, are much less kind of sanguine and happy about the changes because essentially they're losing a lot of their entitlements. I mean, and the job guarantees that they had. I mean, for instance, something like 70% of the Saudi population worked for the public sector. Now it's down to the low 60s. But the government is encouraging all these people to take early retirement so they get off the payroll because that's the
Oh,
biggest chunk of the fiscal budget. So, older people tend not to be happy. A lot of royals are deeply unhappy with what he's done because he's taken away their privileges. Um, there are lots of anecdotes about this. I was at Riyadh airport arriving, and I was waiting in line at passport control, and a Saudi prince with his flunky cut the line because he was a Saudi prince, and that used to be the case always before. You just go straight through. And the passport guy said no. Stands at the back of the line like everybody else, and if he has any problem, he takes it up with Mohammed bin Salman. You know, and the fact that the passport control guy was not afraid to speak to a Saudi royal that way
yeah,
tells
yeah.
you a lot about how things have changed.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I assume that everyone else who was standing in line
Loved it.
was loved it. Yeah.
Loved it. They've been waiting for these royals to be put in their place for a very long time.
Huh. Well, that's very, very interesting. I think that some of these, the way I understand some of these kind of marquee programs, like Neom, um, part of what they're doing, it's kind of like Donald Trump's and Elon Musk talking about the Space Force and going to Mars and so on. They're meant they're meant to capture the imagination of the people and move them in the direction of a modern market-driven high-tech economy. Rather than whether we ever get Naom is precisely as imagined is not really the point. Is that the way you would understand that as well?
Yeah, I think so. And also you have to realize that, this is a country that was transformed with a single project, and that was the American oil company Aramco, discovering oil and then turning the country overnight from one of the poorest in the world to one of the richest, or eventually one of the richest. And also they have experienced, building two industrial cities in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s that also transformed the petrochemical industry. So, their idea of like building big projects that are transformational are part of the kind of the history and the DNA and the political and economic imagination of the country. And so I think part of the idea behind some of these giga projects, they call them giga projects.
Uh-huh.
So if you build it, they will come. It's a bit like building Las Vegas, for instance. So in a way, there are a lot of similarities with America in how they think of these big projects. Now, whether they'll succeed, I'm not sure, but certainly they're aspirational. They are supposed to be sort of signals of how great the country will eventually be. And of course, MBS intends to eclipse all the other countries of the GCC, and he wants this to be the hub of the entire region, linking Asia and Africa, Europe and America. Uh,
Oh, it's fascinating. That raises the question now of foreign policy and some of the tensions with the other surrounding states. But I'll come back to that. Let me just end this part of the discussion about the domestic transformation with one question. Uh, how how is it possible that everyone under 35, or the majority of people under 35, went for this? Again, I go back to this thing. I don't think I've ever seen a country change so drastically in such a short period of time. There had to have been, um, after 9/11, there was so much discussion about Saudi Arabia as a factory for extremism and so on. And there had been a lot of talk about all the indoctrination of the young people and so on. So clearly they were not that indoctrinated because there has to be a social
yeah.
basis for this transformation. And that's, I think, one of the more striking things about all of this.
Yeah, and I think what MBS realized, because he is young himself, is that this generation of under 30, 35s are people who are basically came to, to kind of adulthood after 9/11. And this is when social media exploded in Saudi Arabia. And so, you have one of the highest penetration rates of social media anywhere in the world in the kingdom. And people there look and see what's happening in Abu Dhabi and see what's happening in Lebanon, see what's happening elsewhere, and they want this, they want it. They also want it. And he realized that. Now, I had mentioned earlier that there's a sting to this
Oh yeah.
love and expectation, which is that, if MBS doesn't manage to deliver on the promises of good jobs and, prosperity and all the rest, you could end up with a very angry, group of people who then would be ripe for the picking for Islamists who still exist and are kind of under, in hiding right now. But you do still have oppositional ideologies and movements that can take advantage of resentment and anger at the non-delivery of the promise.
Okay, so now you have now you again. There's a foreign policy dimension to this because that's going to take us to Gaza. But again, I will just make that note that and then move on because I have a kind of way I want to structure this discussion with you. I'd like to move now from the domestic agenda of Mohammed bin Salman to the attractions, the relative attractions for him, a man in a hurry who wants to modernize his economy, the relative attractions to him of the United States versus China. And can you give us a sense of how he's thinking about that?
So Saudi Arabia is regarded as what is called a middle power. And I think that what he would like to do is to be an opportunist who can take advantage of all his relationships. So he sells most of his oil to the East, but his security, his culture, his finance, his tech is mostly American and focused toward the United States. So he would like, I think, ultimately to become a strategic ally and to be recognized as a strategic ally of the United States, but not give up on the ability to sell oil and to have commercial relations with China. And when it comes to Russia, to deal with the Russians on questions of oil production quotas through the OPEC plus. So there's no love for Russia, there's no love for China, but they are commercial and economic partners that are deeply useful to him. I think
So,
that's how he kind of sees the world. And also the way he also sees the region is that he wants stability and order to be able to build out the economy. And for that to happen, he doesn't want to have wars or tensions around. So he'd like to calm the Iranians, to end the war in Yemen, to end the war in Sudan. He'd like to find a solution to the Palestinian issue so that he can get on with the business of building.
okay. Um, uh, Let me tell you how I translate what you just said into sort of what might be Mohammed bin Salman's governing principle. Um, First of all, before I say that, uh, let me ask you a question. Am I right in all that you've described, sort of the attitudes of the under 35s and so on, that there's a natural cultural, social gravitation toward the West?
Yeah, absolutely.
The
And,
the
and
pre
the entire elite is educated in America. You have hundreds of thousands of graduates from American universities, and English is the language of many of these elites, right? Including
Right.
inside their families. So yes, they're totally oriented to America and not to China. And when they are interested in Eastern things, it's like K-pop in South Korea or
Yeah.
manga in Japan. It's very kind of superficial stuff. There's no deep cultural connection to the East.
So so then I would say that that translates into a policy preference for Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah.
The policy preference is I'm a man in a hurry. I need to, I want to develop civil nuclear power. I want to develop my high tech economy. I want to be a leader in AI. I want to be a hub for the regional hub for the global transport system and everything else. I want to be a communications hub and so on. Um, and in developing these hubs and these initiatives, my preference is to go with the United States and to a lesser extent, Europe. but I don't have a lot of time to wait around.
Yeah.
So I give the United States the first right of refusal.
Right.
But if they're not going to work with me on AI, I'm going to go to China because these are or no, let's say if the United States is not going to work with me, I'm going to look for an acceptable Western partner that will not offend the West.
Yeah.
So I'll buy
So look,
Turkish.
I
I'll
mean,
buy Turkish. If the Americans won't sell me drones, I'll buy Turkish drones.
yeah.
But I'm gonna. But they need to know I have this Chinese option, and if I'm blocked in developing these things, I will go to China.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, first let me say that he doesn't think much of Europe at all. Okay, he thinks of it as kind of like a place to go for tourism and good food, and doesn't see like major AI companies there. His preference is for the superior technology of the United States. So he wants to link up with the United States on five different agreements that have already been negotiated and are close to being signed. I mean, they could be easily signed any minute now. Let me just list them very quickly. So first is a mutual defense agreement comparable to South Korea or Japan. Two is this nuclear agreement for civil nuclear power production and enrichment because they're convinced they have huge uranium mines and they'd like to get into the business of exporting uranium. Uh, Three, they want a free trade agreement with the United States. Four, they want a streamlined and quick process for purchasing weapons from the United States so that these weapons.
Good luck.
No?
Not because of Saudi Arabia. If there's one thing that's screwed up, I've never talked to an American ally who wasn't just completely flabbergasted by the difficulty with the difficulties that we put in the way of anyone getting our weaponry.
Right. And fifth is the AI agreement. So he wants US AI companies to come to the kingdom. He'll give them land, he'll give them almost no regulation and free energy. So those are
Wow.
three things that are basically hard to get in the United States.
Yes.
And that will make them competitive with the Chinese. Now, he will flirt with the Chinese, but he knows that the technology is not as good. And he also knows that if he decides to go with China, he then loses a lot from the United States. Remember that his entire military kit is American. And
Yeah.
Americans will basically say to him, if you bring in Huawei or you bring in the Chinese, we won't sell you any more weapon systems. And the Chinese are not going to come and save you. In fact, what the US should be telling him, and I think he's well aware of this, is that look at the threat of the Houthis in Yemen recently. The Houthis are trying to block shipping from the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, and they were attacking Israeli related shipping, but also American and European ships. And the Americans went to the Chinese and said, could you put pressure on Iran to get the Houthis to stop attacking our ships? What did the Chinese do? They went and cut a deal with the Houthis. They were paying the Houthis so that their ships don't get attacked, and their insurance rates are much lower than all the other ships. They're not interested in safeguarding maritime shipping in the region. They're only interested in themselves. And I think the Saudis realize this. They don't want a power that's essentially not going to come and help in maintaining order and stability in the region.
I have to say, from an American point of view, that move of Washington reaching out to Beijing to solve the problem with the Houthis is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard of. Because if you're Saudi Arabia and you see that the American answer to this problem that you have in Yemen is for the Americans to go to China, what do you need America for? Why just cut out the middleman and go direct?
Right. So that was, as you could imagine, under the Biden administration.
Yes, yeah. But so Trump is changing that now. Okay, so another. If I modify my operating principle that I made up of Mohammed bin Salman's operating principle, another thing that you want to do, you want to keep lines out to the Chinese, just to keep the Americans to keep the Americans honest, because the Americans have this tendency to come up with these dumb ideas, like reaching out to Iran and organizing the region by coming to some kind of agreement with Iran, turning a blind eye to Houthi violence and so on. And so you want to have a preferential arrangement with the Americans, but you do not want to be under their thumb. because they if they take you for granted, they do stupid things. Would you agree with
That's
that?
correct. And also that, Americans, because of our electoral cycles and because of the polarization in the country, you go with these kind of crazy oscillations in policy that the Saudis find unbearable because they just want consistency and they want, the mutual interest to prevail over, say, coming to them and calling them a pariah state or,
Right, right.
dealing with them on the basis because you want to please, say, a left group in the Democrat Party, right? So they don't want to be involved in all of that. They just want to say, like, what are our core interests? Let's just stick to them.
I talked to a representative yesterday of another Middle Eastern country. I won't say which one, but one that had very good relations with Israel under Trump one. And then they were describing to me the cold shoulder they got from the Biden team when the Biden team came in. It didn't surprise me that they got a cold shoulder, but some of the things that the Biden team did were manifestly not in the interest of the United States. I mean, they were like they were empowering enemies of the United States just in order to show that there's a price to be paid for getting into bed with Donald Trump. So we whipsaw our allies like this in a way that's because of our internal polarization,
Right.
we've divided up the world outside our borders to Republican allies and Democratic allies. And you
And you
can't.
could also, if you see it from the Saudi point of view, so look at the Biden administration. So the Biden administration comes in, treats the Saudis badly, releases a memo from the CIA, delists the Houthis from the terrorism list, calls them pariah, etc. Then what happens? The midterm elections show up. And there's this fear with the high, because we're coming out of COVID, that high oil prices are going to lead to a red wave in the midterms. So the Biden team goes out to Saudi and starts begging for more oil production to bring the price of oil down. And then when Russia invades Ukraine, they double down and ask the Saudis even more oil production. So the Saudis see the Americans as basically, people who just come out for their domestic politics to kind of to want to politicize oil production to help one team against another. And the Saudis really don't appreciate this way of operating. And the Biden team completely did an about turn once they realized how important Saudi was for oil in the last 2 years of their administration.
Yeah, they convinced themselves at the beginning that one, uh, we live in a post fossil fuels age, which we do not. I mean, fossil fuels continues to run 80% of the global economy, or if not more, and they have some kind of memory in their mind. This is how I'm understanding. Again, I'm making a statement that's really a question. There's some memory in their mind that there's this connection between Saudi oil production and global oil prices, and there's a lever that the U.S. can pull. But that was based on a compact back from the 1940s on, where the Saudis help us with that, but we provide the security. We stabilize the region around them so that they can play this role with us. If we're gonna empower the Houthis and say we want to use that lever, we've actually cut the cord between the lever and which requires trust between Riyadh and Washington.
And that's why MBS on both occasions when they were asked both times, once at the end of 2021 and again in July 2022, the Saudis smiled and then gave them the finger.
Yeah, well, it is funny. We're also I'm sure that once something like the Ukraine war began, we become very morally self-righteous. And we must look very funny to people who we become morally self-righteous. We can't understand why anyone in the world would not immediately come join us in our moral crusade. Anyway, okay, enough on us. Let's move then to the region, and let's start with Iran.
Okay.
You mentioned before that this worldview, this desire for development, integration in the global economy, this leads to a desire, which I think has been the kind of the default Saudi attitude forever, really, for stability.
Correct.
So, So they're looking at the Iran negotiations right now. We're going to have over the weekend direct negotiations or indirect negotiations, depending upon who you're reading, between the Americans and the Iranians. How is Mohammed bin Salman reading that?
All right. So here, I need to explain a little bit about recent history. So essentially, the Saudis saw what the Israelis did to Hamas and then to Hezbollah and then to the militias in Iraq and then to Iran itself. And of course, they were very pleased to see Iran cut down and weakened. However, what the Iranians did in response to that weakening of the arc, that runs from Iran to the Eastern Mediterranean, is that the Iranians threatened the Saudis. They said that if the Israelis and the Americans attack us, we're going to retaliate, and our regime is existentially threatened. Tehran will attack your oil installations, your desalination plants, and your electricity generation plants. In other words, we'll retaliate by devastating your economy. And in the Persian Gulf, the Iranians still have that capacity, whereas everywhere else they've lost it because the distances are very short across the Gulf.
They can just send ballistic missiles over a big barrage like
Yeah,
they sent against the Israelis, but it'll come much quicker.
that's right. And these countries are very vulnerable. Like just imagine a missile hitting one of the towers in Dubai, and that's the end of the Dubai model. It just, collapses. So they're very vulnerable to Iranian attack. And so the Saudi view is we like to see Iran weakened, but we don't want you to uh, get into a war with them where we end up paying the price, as the victims of that war, right? So they want some sort of guarantee that they will be protected. And so the Saudis have basically adopted this position where it's a kind of ambivalent position. On the one hand, they want to see Iran weakened, but they don't want to be attacked, and because they're vulnerable. And we don't have systems yet in place, anti-missile systems, anti-drone systems that will protect their installations, right? So I think that's something they must be working on right now, at full throttle to try to defend their facilities. So that's where things stand, I think, vis-a-vis Iran. And I think they're also looking to a Trump administration that will essentially cut most of Iranian production, which means that the price of oil will soar, and they will make up for that production themselves with their own by increasing their own production. So, in other words, they want to see Iran punished, but not punished so much that they end up getting attacked. That's the
So,
bottom line.
there are big implications for the United States for what you just said. Before I draw them out, let me ask you one question. These threats from the Iranians to the Saudis that, if Israel or if Israel and the United States attack Iran will retaliate against Saudi Arabia. I saw some of those were broadcast over the airwaves. I can't remember, some IRGC general perhaps made the threat. But were they, to your knowledge, were they transmitted also directly to the
Oh,
Saudis?
absolutely. Yeah, the
Uh,
foreign minister in a meeting with MBS told him this.
uh-huh.
And MBS basically, in response to the Iranians, said, we're neutral. We're not going to help in the attack on you. But if you attack us, we're going to counterattack. And we have the capability of attacking you as well. So, but essentially the Iranians menaced him directly.
Wow. Okay, I did not know that. Okay, has that been well reported? I missed that. That's
I don't think, I mean, I know it from Saudi sources, but
okay. So the implication of that is because people are always asking us, uh, will Israel attack Saudi Arabia? I'm sorry, will Israel attack Iran without the Americans? And I think that this is you just made a very important point. There's no way that the United States can be on the sidelines in an Iranian-Israeli conflict. Iran will directly retaliate against Israel, like we've already seen twice with ballistic missiles from Iranian soil. And that will require American defensive, CENTCOM defensive systems, which include sensors in other countries as well. So there's no way this doesn't get internationalized immediately, only in sense of defending Israel from the ballistic missile barrages. But then, if the Iranians are threatening the Saudis, the only power that can really effectively deter the Iranians from widening the front in the way that you have described is the United States. So that's also going to draw the United States into any Israeli plan. If the United States gets wind of the fact that Israel is planning some kind of attack without the United States permission, then the United States is going to get involved.
And I think the Iranians will attack. I mean, in addition to attacking the Saudis, I mean, they'll attack shipping. They'll attack the U.S. troops that are, in the Gulf. I mean, this is again in a situation where the regime feels existentially threatened.
Yeah.
I think the regime though doesn't have the capacity to like wage a full-on war. They can what they will want to do is to kind of is to damage the global economy, really mainly through oil and gas.
Mm, yeah.
And I suspect they will target the Saudis and the UAE, but not Qatar, for instance, probably not Kuwait. Uh,
Right.
uh,
Because those countries have been hedging toward Iran.
correct.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move then to the UAE, because you mentioned earlier, you made some very provocative, or I would say interesting statements about Mohammed bin Salman seeing the UAE as a competitor, being 15 years ahead of them, and so on. What is we for a while we thought that they were sort of brothers moving together. Now I see signs of competition. If we had Mohammed bin Salman here and were to ask him, and he was feeling completely free to speak his mind, what would he say is his attitude toward Abu Dhabi?
So I think this is whether it's Mohammed bin Salman or any other Saudi. So the Saudi is big brother, it's the 800-pound gorilla, and the UAE is the little child, just by virtue of size, population, and territory. So any Saudi ruler will want the UAE to sort of understand that the UAE is not the equal of Saudi Arabia and will have to kind of defer to the Saudis, and that Saudi survival ultimately is extremely important for the very survival of the UAE. I think one way in which this is expressed is something like this. So MBS would tell you, look, the UAE has a population, what, 800,000 people? They inflated to a million, million too. But there isn't a problem they have with their native, we're talking native population, that $100 billion wouldn't solve. I can throw $100 billion in Saudi Arabia, it won't solve anything,
Mm.
because my population is too big, my territory is too big, my problems are too big. So I think there's that attitude of the big kind of country versus the small country, which we see in other places. Then there's the question of a structural competition between the two countries. In other words, how many, world-class ports can you have for transportation logistics in that area, right? So the Saudis want to have the big port, and the big port right now is actually in the UAE. They want to be the tech hub of the region. The tech hub of the region now is much more in the UAE than it is in Saudi. So there's deep competition that is, I think, not necessarily bad. It's healthy, but it's a competition over, who's going to dominate, these different sectors of this diversified economy that's being built in Saudi Arabia. And by the way, the UAE has exactly the same problems as Saudi Arabia, which is that it's very dependent on fossil fuels and petrochemicals, and it's also trying to diversify in the same way. So,
Uh,
some of this competition is inevitable.
uh-huh. Uh-huh. Would you say that this is competition among friends and allies, or is it moving beyond that?
No, no, I think they're friends and allies, but there are differences between them. Like for instance, let's take the example of two examples. In Yemen, the Saudis wanted the UAE to be much more aggressive than they have been. At some point, the UAE, having lost a lot of troops there, decided it's going to basically not play an active role. And the Saudis are still playing an active role in Yemen. In the Sudan, for instance, the Saudis are not in favor of the rapid, support forces that the UAE is backing. And they don't want to see a civil war in the Sudan. They want to see a stable Sudan. That's the Saudi view. The UAE has been playing a role that's very destabilizing in the Sudan. And the problem for the Saudis, they don't want to see lots of Sudanese refugees crossing the Red Sea and coming over to them. So there are some real differences between them. But ultimately, I think they both realize that their survival, their mutual survival, depends on being, holding together and supporting one another.
Okay, let's move into the Houthis because there was just before October 7th, the Saudis and the Houthis seemed to be on the cusp of a peace agreement that went on hold. What's your understanding of the relationship between them now, and give us a sense of how Mohammed bin Salman is thinking about them?
Yeah, so he thinks that they are, a real problem. They're a source of instability. They, in their dreams, would like to become like Hezbollah in Lebanon, vis-a-vis Israel, with lots of missiles aimed at Saudi, and essentially blackmailing Saudi Arabia and extorting money from the Saudis. Um, they would like to see them again kind of cut down to size. They would like to see them ideally excluded from the political game, but they can't exclude them. So they want the Houthis to come to some sort of compromise with the other Yemeni actors. And the Saudis are willing to give some money to help stabilize Yemen, but only on condition that the Houthis behave properly. In other words, not fire missiles and drones and attack other people, both inside Yemen and across the border into Saudi Arabia. Good luck with that. Because the
Wow.
Houthis, I mean, are not going to behave that way. The Houthis are a very radical, theocratic movement that whose very existence depends on instability and shooting at ships and shooting at the Saudis. And so right now we're in a kind of holding pattern where I think the Saudis are essentially in a truce with them. Although a few days ago there was an attack across the border, a Houthi attack on Saudis.
I
So
missed that.
yeah, so it's a very tense situation, and the Houthis are stoking this very radical ideology, a very anti-Saudi ideology, anti-American, anti-West, and so on. And the Houthis represent some 5% of the Yemeni population. They're a specific group of people called Sayyids, and the only way a group can stay in power that's a minority like that is to constantly uh, be extremely aggressive ideologically and radical, because that's what gives it sort of legitimacy. That's why, for instance, in Syria, the Alawites were always anti-Israel, or used that rhetoric against Israel because that was the source of legitimacy for their minoritarian rule. And you have a similar phenomenon in Yemen with the Houthis.
Huh. Okay, let's then move to two more issues, and then we can wrap it up. And those are Gaza and Syria. I think these are the big ones. Which one do you want to take first?
I mean, let's do Syria maybe.
Okay.
I think, on Syria, you have a division again between the UAE and Saudi on how they view Syria. So the UAE essentially sees the new rulers in Syria, the HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, as jihadists, and they're Islamists, and they don't want to see the Islamists in power in Syria or anywhere else for that matter. That's one of the reasons why in the Sudan they support Hemeti, the Rapid Support Forces guy, because they see the main army as an Islamist army in the Sudan. So the UAE is against this guy. They're against the kind of Turkish Islamist, the use of Turkey of Islamists to come to take over, governments. The Saudis, I think, are not on the same page with the UAE. The Saudis want, again, calm, stability. They're willing to give the Turks kind of the benefit of the doubt. They're going to tell the Turks, if you can bring this group and you can defang the Islamism and the jihadism and you can bring stability to Syria, we'll help you. But we're going to test it, and we're not going to throw money at this unless you prove to us that these guys are actually building institutions, they're not corrupt, they're serving their people, they're not crazy, and so on. So that's the Saudi position on Syria right now, but they're not all in. Okay, they're kind of like the jury's out on Syria when it comes to the Saudis.
But this is very interesting. It's very, very interesting because two things jump out at me about this. One is just a few years ago, we had a real sharp division in the region between Ankara and Riyadh.
Yeah,
And so the UAE and the Saudis were on one side, and Ankara and the Qataris were on the other side. And of course, after the Khashoggi incident, there was a real polarization between Ankara and Riyadh. And then the second issue is that we have this nationalist transformation that you have described in Saudi Arabia, which means a very, very pronounced movement internally away from Islamism domestically. But it doesn't, neither of these things translated into hostility or overt, maybe some wariness, but not overt hostility to the Turkish support for Shara in Damascus. How do you explain that? I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it has to do with MBS and it has to do with some of the advisors around him. So, after the Khashoggi incident, you had a whole new set of advisors who are the old timers, the old guard, came back in a big way in the royal court. And these are people who are deeply pragmatic and not ideological. They understand that the mission is to support Saudi first. And if it means sometimes dealing with Islamists like the Islah movement in Yemen, for instance, then so be it. The army in Sudan, so be it. If they're Islamist. In other words, pragmatism trumps ideology if it leads to a result that you want to see happen. So if you want to see the stability of Syria and you want to see, some sort of semblance of good governance, if it comes with a soft Islamism, well, it's not ideal, but it's better than chaos. It's better than the alternative. And I think that's how they now operate. And it tells you that, MBS has changed. You know, he the
Oh, interesting. Very
like
interesting.
the first 3, 4 years, he was much more aggressive, forward-leaning,
He was in a
ideological.
bigger hurry. He slowed
Yeah.
down a little. Yeah.
Now he's like in a much more like, can I work this so that I get the results that I want, even if it means, supping with the devil, for a bit. And that's I think the attitude that prevails today. And the national security advisor in Saudi Arabia is a key person in that respect.
Tell us a little bit more about him.
So he's an American trained lawyer. I think he went to Harvard. His name is Msaad Al-Aiban. He's, if you meet him, I don't know if you've ever seen the
I've
BBC.
never met him. No.
Yeah, well, even if you were to meet him, he's about a lot like Sir Humphrey and, yes, minister, yes, prime minister. He's a bureaucrat's bureaucrat. He can talk for 3 hours and not tell you anything. But he's a brilliant guy. He's a very, very smart guy. And he has a file on everything and everyone, and knows countries inside out. And I think is playing a very good role in sort of guiding and advising on a policy of pragmatism.
Huh. This is really fascinating. And so this leads to the last thing, which is Gaza, but not just Gaza. I want to talk about the Saudi view of Israel, because this all leads, everything that you've really given us a great understanding here of, I think, what the world looks like from Riyadh. And I can almost predict what that means with regard to Israel. But why don't let's start with let's start with let's actually start not with Gaza, but with Israel, Syria, Israel, Iran, and then Gaza.
Okay. So, as far as I understand, you can correct me, but the Israelis have basically decided they don't want a strong central government in Damascus that's led by a kind of former jihadist or, and they see that there's some competition with the Turks as well. They would rather have a kind of decentralized, more federated Syria with the Druze and the Kurds and other minorities sort of controlling different spheres of influence in the country. A bit kind of like Lebanon, when during the Civil War or after the Civil War, you had these different areas. I don't think the Saudis are with the Israelis, if this is a correct characterization of Israeli.
Can I offer you a different characterization,
Sure, go ahead.
which is how I see it, which is related to what you said, but not exactly the same thing. And I'll add another dimension to it and get your reaction. I think when the Israelis look at Syria, at Shara, it isn't Shara that scares them. Shara has sent all the right messages toward Israel that they need to hear, which are which are I don't want my enemy, Shah's told them explicitly, my enemy is Iran, your enemy is Iran. We have the same enemy. I want to stabilize Syria. I'm not interested in a war with Israel. Israel's carried out military operation after military operation, bombing since Shah took over. Shah has kept quiet about it. That isn't what scares them. What scares the Israelis is Erdogan in Ankara. So they see Erdogan, they see Turkish power coming down like gangbusters into Syria after they hollowed out the Assad regime. So they did the work on the ground, and then the Turks came in and just took all the chips off the table, and they're afraid President Erdogan has prayed openly for the destruction of Israel. He has hosted Hamas. He's hosting Hamas leaders in Turkey. He has, encouraged people to look forward to the day when Turkey will liberate Jerusalem. He's accused the Israelis of genocide in Gaza and so on and so forth. So the Israelis read all of this as ideological Islamist jihadi intentions to destroy Israel, and it scares them. And they, since October 7th, they have a kind of a doctrine that they will not allow on their borders, on their immediate borders, any kind of threat to grow and metastasize. So they are sending a real strong message to Ankara that if Ankara doesn't respect their security concerns, they'll blow up this whole project. Okay? And they're looking, to make connections with anyone inside Syria right now, which means mainly through minority groups that can send the message that Israel has these options. But the number one minority group that they have a relationship with is the Druze, and that's because the Druze are an important part of the Israeli security structure inside Israel. They're right across the border in Syria, and so they have kind of created a ground game. What the Turks have over the Israelis is the Turks have a ground game in Syria. The Israelis don't. So they've kind of got a ground game by proxy by adopting the Druze of southern Syria, or semi-adopting them, and they've created this power umbrella over southern Syria. What they really want, though, they don't have a vision. This is where I have a slight disagreement with what you said. The Israelis don't have a vision of a post-Assad Syria. They have no idea what it should look like, and they have no idea how to make it, how to create it. And if their conflict with the Turks were to turn into them busting up this whole Shara project of the Turks, they're smart enough to see that the day after we don't have a federated Syria, we have another ignition of the Syrian civil war. And guess who's going to be there with all the power that they have right now? And that's the Turks. The Turks have a Syrian army, the Syrian National Army, which they control from Ankara. So if the Turks want to put jihadi forces on Israel's border, they can do it whether Shara is there or Shara is not there. So the problem that has to be solved is the balance of power between Israel and Turkey. Now, the Turks, when the Israelis look at Shara, they see Erdogan. When the Turks look at Israel, they see the UAE. And when they look at the UAE, they see Israel. So it's kind of like these twins. And all those things that you described of the anti-Islamism of the UAE as opposed to Saudi Arabia, this comes to light in the shared Syria policy of the UAE and Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suspect that,
first of all, does that all make sense to you?
it does make sense. It does make sense. And I would say from the Saudi perspective, they don't want to see a Syria that's dominated by Turkey, and certainly not a Turkey that claims to to don the mantle of Islam and the mantle of liberating Jerusalem. They're tired of all this stuff. And I think this brings me to Gaza, which is that you see that the Saudis are extremely aggressive when now defending Palestinian rights and the right to the Palestinians of a viable state. And if you look at Saudi TV and news programs, they really have gone after Prime Minister Netanyahu, comparing him to Hitler and all that. So my interpretation is of why the Saudis are doing all this, uh, involves two things. First, they see that Iran has tried to monopolize Palestine, and they see that Iran has now lost that ability to claim Palestine and to radicalize populations in the name of Palestine and to advance its interests in the region. They want to take that away from the Iranians. They want to sort of say, the question of Palestine is one that we can lead on, and we want to lead on it in the way that, King Faisal once used to lead as well. We want to speak in the name of the Palestinians and deny it to the Iranians, and I think also deny it to the Turks. They don't want to see the Turks in that role either. So that's
Very interesting.
so that's one reason why they're talking so big on Palestine. The other, even though they have no respect for the Palestinian Authority the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, they see them a bunch of corrupt, useless people. Essentially, the Saudis don't have, and MBS in particular, has zero respect for leaders who don't serve their own people. In other words, people who are just in power to enrich themselves or to help their cronies, but offer nothing for their own people, but misery and suffering and poverty is not something he appreciates, and he thinks it's disgusting, and he doesn't want to deal with people like that. So that's basically his view of Abu Mazen, of the Palestinian Authority. Now, the other reason I would say that they're, donning the mantle of Palestine is that their population, because of the imagery out of Gaza and so on, especially the young who were not politicized, have become politicized because of this stuff. And he must feel that there's pressure from within his society. This is MBS, feels there's pressure from within his society to do something on for the Palestinians. So that's the second reason I think that he's pushing the Palestine. Now, what he really wants, though, are these 5 deals with the Americans, these 5 agreements.
Yeah.
And if the cost of those 5 agreements is normalization with Israel, this was something he was willing to do before October 7th, 2023. Is he now still willing to do it? Maybe. If something is offered to the Palestinians, whether it's symbolic or real, is still, I think, not something that's been decided in Riyadh.
I can't see the current political reality in Israel. I can't see the Israelis offering him the minimum that he would need in order to say that he got that. But then, okay, so my final question, this has been really great. I think we have I have a much better understanding now of what the world looks like from Riyadh. But one last question for you. Um, uh, President Trump is going to Saudi Arabia, I think in May. Is that right? He's going soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, what are the top agenda items? I think you've already told it's probably these 5 items, but what does Mohammed bin Salman want to get out of this trip?
Well, I think he would like to give President Trump like something big, like
Arms deal?
no. I think first he wants President Trump to get the Nobel Prize for ending the Ukraine-Russia war.
Uh-huh.
And first, the Saudis to have played a key role as mediators in that. So I think
Yeah.
he wants to put, like, the branding of Saudi Arabia is important, and the success of Saudi Arabia as a mediator is an important, symbolically very important. In terms of more concrete things from Trump, he certainly would want those 5 agreements that I talked about. The mutual defense, the streamlining of sales of arms sales, nuclear, AI, and being called a strategic ally, and free trade. Those are things that are really important, I think, to him. They will talk about Palestine and Israel, I'm sure, um, but and I think they'll talk about oil as well, because I think there's an inconsistency in President Trump's demand for lower oil prices, because you can get lower oil prices with increased Saudi production, but you will damage the U.S. oil industry if it's
Yeah.
too low.
Yeah.
So I think they have to come to some sort of agreement on where they
On
will
where the band is.
where the band is.
You
So that
also want he wants to encourage fracking. That requires a certain amount of money.
exactly,
Yeah.
because it's much more expensive to produce in the U.S. than it is in Saudi. So
Yeah.
I think those are the issues. I think also, though, the Saudis are wary of President Trump in that he can ask them for something that they cannot deliver. And namely, he's going to say to them, the UAE just promised me $1.4 trillion of investments in the US. Why don't you top that? And Saudis don't have that kind of money because they have all the domestic projects that
They
they've
have 36 million people.
and
Right.
and they have their domestic,
Yeah.
projects. So, they're going to say to him something like, "We already have $1 trillion invested in your country, and we need money to build out our country as well." So I think they're worried about the kind of asks and whether these are very transactional asks. He's going to say, if he says to them, "I protect you, you've got to pay," that's going to, not go down well in Riyadh.
Well, I think if I were Donald Trump looking at this, the real opportunities here, let's forget about the American domestic demands, but just from a foreign policy point of view, there isn't a lot to be seen. That the thing that people have been talking so much about in the last few years, the Saudi-Israeli normalization, that really isn't on the cards right now.
Yeah.
And Gaza is still going on. There's no answer there. The U.S. Iranian negotiations are going to follow their own logic. The Saudis can put some input into it and so on, but I don't think they can really change it. But where there's a real opportunity, I think, for both Washington and Riyadh here is Syria. The Saudi pragmatism in Syria offers an opportunity, I think, for Donald Trump to bring together, not in a love clinch, but at least in alignment of policies among the Israelis, the Turks, and the Saudis, who are really now, I think, the three most important actors for the American regional order. And if we can find a modus vivendi between the Turks and the Israelis, then that could be we could add to that a Saudi component where the Saudis could help deliver the Gulf states for investment. And we could have a stabilization of one of the parts of the Middle East that has been the most disruptive. One of the most disruptive parts of the Middle East could actually be stabilized and then in the process shore up the new American order. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think, they can help establish ground rules. Basically, what you need is an understanding between the Turks and the Israelis as to what the ground rules are in Syria. And really, the prize, I mean, Syria is a prize, not just because you want it to prosper and stabilize and all that. You want the Iranians never to be able to rebuild that land bridge.
Right, right. We're building the post-Iranian Middle East. That's what we're building.
Correct.
Yeah, and there's an opportunity here. I hope we can seize it. All right, Bernie, thank you very much. This has been enormously enlightening, and I suspect that people all around the world are going to be interested in what you just had to say.
You're very kind. It was a real pleasure, my friend.
Thank you.
Take care.